Hey everybody, this is chapter 9 of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia. Chapter 9 is titled The Imperialist Expansion of Russia. Um, the headings of this chapter include the example of Japanese imperialism, the motives for the expansion of the Stalinist bureaucracy. So here we go. Empires existed before the monopolist stage of capitalism, and even before capitalism itself. The Persian Empire rose at an almost unparalleled tempo between 555 and 525 BC and comprised an area 8 times larger than that of Germany. Subsequently, the Greek Empire rose, then the Roman Empire. The decline of feudalism and the rise of commercial capital saw the rise of big Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, England in 2 generations, from the beginning of the 7 Years' War, 1756, to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1814, built its empire by conquering Canada, the decisive section of India, South Africa, and Australia. The imperialism of every period, however, is different in its motives and results, and the use of the one word, imperialism, to describe the different phenomena is therefore liable to bring about more confusion than clarity. Lenin used the term for the highest stage of capitalism, when it is in decline, and when the proletarian revolution is on the order of the day. But the empires of even this one period have very different characters. Zinoviev says in his article, What is Imperialism? Quote, in doing this, defining what modern imperialism actually is, we must not forget that there are various types of imperialism. British imperialism differs from German imperialism, etc. There is a European imperialism, an Asiatic imperialism, and an American imperialism. There is a white imperialism and a yellow imperialism. Japanese imperialism doesn't resemble the French type. Russian imperialism is of quite a unique type. Because it is it is not even possible any longer to say an Asiatic imperialism, developing on the basis of an extraordinary backwardness, end quote. Zinoviev. If, as Lenin explains, the typical feature of imperialism is the search for yields for capital export, while for youthful capitalism the typical feature was the search for markets, it seems wrong to have called Tsarist Russia imperialist. But all the Marxists, including Lenin and Trotsky, did call it imperialist, and they were correct. For in the context of world economy and the relations prevailing between Tsarist Russia and the highly developed countries, which is the criterion for its definition, Tsarist Russia was imperialist in the Leninist sense. Lenin's definition of imperialism gives the following 5 essential features. 1. The concentration of production and capital developed to such a stage that it creates monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on the basis of, quote, finance capital of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital, which has become extremely important and distinguished from the export of commodities. 4. The formation of international capitalist monopolies which share the world among themselves. 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers is completed. Footnote. See Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. End footnote. Of the first feature, state capitalism is certainly a species, as it consists of one general state monopoly. As regards the second feature, the merging of bank and industrial capital reaches the highest stage when the state is the industrial and banking capitalist together. As regards the fourth feature, the increasing competition between the imperialist powers drives the state, especially emphasized in Germany and Japan, to cut across international capitalist monopolies. It is clear that the economic invasion of an international capitalist monopoly is nearly excluded in a state capitalist economy. Some foreign concessions, of course, are not excluded. The third and fifth features, the third feature being the export of capital, which has become extremely important and distinguished from the export of commodities, and the fifth feature, the territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers, is completed. The relations of the third and fifth, those are the third and fifth features. The third and fifth features, the relation of Russian state capitalism to the export of capital and to the territorial division of the world, needs further elaboration. Section 1. The example of Japanese imperialism. Of all the countries in the world except Stalinist Russia, which reached the highest centralization of capital, was Japan. It was estimated that the quote, Big Four, Zaibatsu, family monopoly organizations, controlled 60% of the capital invested in all Japanese joint stock companies. The parallel figure for 1929 was 45%. Footnote. This is an indication why it is not excluded theoretically, although in practice there is no ground to assume that it will happen, that all the national capital will be concentrated in the hands of one trust. End footnote. At the same time as the centralization of capital in Japan is much higher than in any other capitalist country, including Stalinist Russia, the productive forces of Japan lag far behind those of the countries of the West. This combination of highly centralized capital and the great backwardness of the country as a whole explains the specific character of Japanese imperialism, which distinguishes it from other imperialisms and makes it very similar in many respects to Stalinist imperialism. An outline of the specific features of Japanese imperialism will therefore help us to clarify some of the aspects of Stalinist imperialism. The industrial output of Japan increased very rapidly during the present century. In the years 1913 to 1928, the tempo of this advance is about 3 times that of Britain in the years 1860 to 1913. That is, every year they produced on average 6% more than the year before. Between 1927 and 1936, the industrial output of Japan increased approximately 100%, and E.B. Schumpeter could justifiably write, quote, It is no longer possible to state, as one careful and well-informed writer did in 1930, that Japan can never become a manufacturing nation of major importance, because of the lack of fuel and iron, which are essential in peace as well as war. Japan has become a major manufacturing nation. The rise of the heavy industries has been the striking development of recent years. Before the Depression, it was the textile industries, food preparation, pottery, and paper manufacturing which predominated. In 1935, just under half. In 1937, about 55%. And in 1938, about 61% of the total value of industrial production was accounted for by metals, chemicals, machinery, and engineering products. This meant that Japan produced her own ships and many of her own airplanes, but imported automobiles and parts. She was no longer dependent on the outside world for a large part of her steel, fertilizer, arms, ammunition, and machinery, although she still had to import a substantial part of raw materials from which they were manufactured. Since 1937, Japan has made a great effort to develop the raw material resources of the Yen bloc and the adjacent regions in the Pacific area. End quote. Footnote. See G.C. Allen, M.S. Gordon, E.F. Penrose, and E.B. Schumpeter, who I think made that quote. It was I know is the author of that quote. The industrialization of Japan and Manchukuo, 1939 to 1940. If you didn't know what Manchukuo was, that was the name of the puppet state, or the satellite state, established in Manchuria by the Japanese Empire. End footnote. From 1920 to 1936, the output of pig iron increased 4 times, that of steel 8 times, and the kilowatt capacity of electrical power stations 5.5 times. The main increase in industrial output took place in the means of production. Thus, the value of output of the chemical, metal, and machine industries rose from about 2,000 million yen in 1926 to more than 9,000 million in 1937, i.e., 4.5 times. The output of all the other industries increased only from about 5,150 million yen to 7,420 million, i.e., an increase of 44%. In the same year, as prices rose by 40%, so that we may conclude that the output of means of production rose about 3 times, while the output of means of consumption remained unchanged. That the increase in the output of heavy industry cannot be explained only, or even mainly as a result of armament production, will be clear from the following fact. Quote, between 1933 and 1936, the value of metals, chemicals, machinery, and tools produced in establishments employing 5 or more people increased from 3 to 6 billion yen, whereas the total expenditure on the Army and Navy, only a fraction of which was spent on armaments, rose from 0.5 billion yen in 1931 to 32 to 1.1 billion yen in 1936 to 37. End quote. Schumpeter. E.B. Schumpeter. Between 1931 to 32 and 1936 to 37, quote, the total annual expenditure of the Army and Navy increased by 60 million yen, while the annual national income increased by 7,000 million yen, or nearly 12 times as much, end quote. E.B. Schumpeter. In this situation of the rapid rise of industrial output in Japan, which was the result of its general backwardness on the one hand and the high concentration of capital on the other, quote, superfluous, end quote, capital did not appear and the rate of profit remained high. Extremely low wages were another important factor allowing this high rate of profit. Quote, average corporate earnings in 1936 and 1937 were from 16 to 20% of paid-up capital, and dividends averaged 8 to 9%, end quote. E.B. Schumpeter. In the light of this, it would be wrong to say that Japanese imperialism sought fields of capital investment because it was faced with a, quote, superfluity of capital and a low rate of profit in Japan herself. That the rate of profit was high, and that the rate of profit did not suffer from an abundance of capital, but from a lack of capital is, however, but the other side of the coin of Japan's backwardness. This causes a very interesting dialectical development. The backwardness of Japan drove her to export on an extremely large scale and to conquer a tremendous empire. In the words of Fritz Sternberg, I have a piece by Fritz Sternberg, some stuff on Fritz Sternberg on this channel. I particularly have things about Fritz Sternberg on the USSR. It's not a primary source, it's a secondary source. It's from Marcel van der Linden's section on Sternberg in Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Anyway, quote, when Great Britain and France founded their empires, they were both leading industrial countries. Their empires were never intended to strengthen their own industrial position. Japan was in a very different situation. Japan's aim was to achieve a rate of development which would reduce the industrial gap between Japan and other capitalist countries, and to become at least as strong and, if possible, still stronger than they were, end quote. Fritz Sternberg, The Coming Crisis. And what year is that? It's from 1947. After the First World War, the foreign investments of the highly developed countries which suffered from an enormous, quote, superfluity of capital, except the U.S., did not increase, but on the contrary, decreased. Even with the U.S., the foreign investments of these countries did not rise beyond the level of 1914, as the following table shows. Footnote, new data for E. Varga and L. Mendelssohn's edited volume. See Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1939. We have estimated the investments of France and Germany for 1935 to be 30 to 40 billion francs. This is, if anything, an overestimation. End footnote. Here's a table. The table says capital invested abroad, billion francs per 1914 parity year. Um, um, Sorry, I'm gonna have to wait. I don't know this. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to explain this chart even very well. Thus, while in the years 1860 to 1914, the quantity of capital invested abroad by the advanced capitalist countries grew almost uninterruptedly. From 1914, when imperialism had reached maturity, the quantity of capital invested abroad never rose above the level of 1914, and even declined below it. As against this, Japan undertook an immense export of capital, especially to Manchuria, her only important colony it had until the Sino-Japanese War. Footnote: for 1932 to 39, G.C. Allen, M.S. Gordon, E.F. Penrose, and E.P. Schumpeter, and also A.J. Grajdenzev, Manchuria, an Industrial Survey, published in Pacific Affairs, December 1945. So there's a chart here that's actually fairly easy to follow. Japanese investment in Manchuria, million yen. In 1932, 97.2 million yen. 1933, 151.2 million yen. 1934, 271.7 million yen. 1935, 378.6 million yen. 1936, 263 million yen. 1937, 484 million yen. 1938, 439 million yen. 1939, 1,103 million yen. 140, Jesus Christ, 1940 to 1943, 2,340 million yen. The Manchuria 5-year plan of 1937 to 41 planned an investment of 2,800 million yen, which was subsequently raised to 4,800 million yen in the revised plan, and then in September 1938 to 6,000 million yen. This figure was impossible of achievement owing to the lack of equipment in Japan and the scarcity of general and skilled labor in particular. Investment reached only about 3,000 million yen in the period laid down by the plan, but even this expressed a very big rise in production, as the following table shows. So I'm going to summarize this table here. Output of some products of Manchuria between 1932 and 1934. In 1932 and 1944. So coal went from 7.1 million tons in 1932 to 30 million tons in 1944. Iron ore went from 0.7 million tons in 1932 to 5.3 million tons in 1943. Pig iron went from 368.2 thousand tons to 1,174.9 thousand tons between 1932 and 1944. And 1932, 593 million kilowatts of electricity, to 1940 with 3,250 million kilowatts of electricity. The steel industry, established in 1935, was after a few years producing more than 1 million tons per annum. Machinery factories were established which supplied the major part of the equipment of Manchurian industry. In 1939, a car industry was established which planned to employ 100,000 workers. A large airplane factory was also established. The construction of ships up to 5,000 tons was begun. The railway network of Manchuria increased from 5,570 kilometers in 1932 to 15,000 kilometers in 1943, more than the whole railway system of China proper. In the light of this development, it is clear why one writer could say, quote, Manchuria ... was to be developed as an extension of the homeland, end quote. And that quote's from an A. Rogers. Sternberg remarked, quote, the given historical conditions in which Japanese imperialism developed caused it to encourage and force the development of industrialization in its empire, whilst different historical conditions caused the European imperialists to prevent or retard industrial development in their empires. In the 10 years between Japan's invasion of Manchuria and her entry into the Second World War, she so accelerated the industrialization of Manchuria that although Manchuria's population is only about 110% of British India's, as much, if not more, industry was created there in 1 decade as was created in India in a century of imperialist rule, end quote. Fritz Sternberg. The industrialization of Manchuria was not left to the blind, unorganized activity of the different Japanese companies, but was carried out by mixed companies of the monopolies and the state according to a plan. Such organization was necessary for rapid industrialization. To my understanding, the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji elite or whatever, drew their model for industrial development and indeed political development to a large extent from Prussia, which to my understanding kind of did a similar thing. I think development in, to my understanding at least, industrial development in and the establishment of capitalism in Germany was massively supported by the state. And I think you can even say that about Tsarism as well. The kind of like spontaneous or whatever, or to the degree that you could say that, more or less hands-off approach to the development of capitalism seems, at least historically in 2025, to have been the exception. Anyway, new section, the motives for the expansion of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Just as the privileges of the bourgeoisie are conditioned by unceasing advance of accumulation, so are the privileges of the Russian bureaucracy conditioned. But unlike the bourgeoisie of the West, Russian state capitalism in its Tugendhat stage suffers neither from a, quote, superfluity of capital, from a restriction of the possibilities of accumulation which the antagonistic mode of distribution causes in traditional capitalist countries, nor from a rise of wages which would threaten the rate of profit. In these respects, Russian state capitalism is more similar to Japanese imperialism before its defeat in the Second World War than to the Western imperialist countries. There is, however, one important difference, seeing that nearly all the means of production in Russia belong to the state. The industrial development of its colonial regions, i.e. the areas of the nations oppressed by the Russian bureaucracy, is directly a part of the general industrial development of Russia itself. The Japanese state saw in Manchuria, quote, an extension of the homeland. The Stalinist state looks upon the Ukraine, the Caucasus, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. in the same way, and because of its monopolistic economic position, its development of these regions is and will be more efficient than that of Japanese imperialism in Manchuria. Just as Japanese imperialism looked upon the development of Manchuria as a necessary step to bridge the distance between it and the advanced powers of the West, so the Stalinist bureaucracy is driven to an imperialist policy for the same reason. The same relative backwardness drives Russia towards the establishment of industries in the countries of the oppressed nations. But as the second side of the same coin, to loot capital wherever Russia can lay hold of it. Japanese imperialism carried out large-scale plunder in China. As regards Germany, quote, in the conquered territories, German firms have taken over the assets of resident concerns by right of conquest, not through, quote, business as usual, end quote. And that quote's from R.A. Brady, Business as a System of Power, published in 1943. Stalinist Russia looted all the countries of Eastern Europe and Manchuria. Stalinist Russia did so not only by transferring factories to Russia, but also, as Nazi Germany did, by concluding barter agreements with its own vassals which were ruinous to its own vassals. The concentrated monopoly capitalism of Japan and Germany and the state capitalism of Russia thus reveal another feature characteristic of the period of the primitive accumulation of capital. The trade and plunder were indistinguishable. If Alfred Marshall could say of that time that, quote, silver and sugar seldom came to Europe without a stain of blood, end quote, today the looted property is much bloodier, and is not silver or sugar that is plundered, but means of production. No additional motive for the imperialist expansion of Russia, an additional motive for the imperialist expansion of Russia is the lack of raw materials. Middle East oil, for example, that of northern Iran in particular, plays a big role in the plans of the Stalinist bureaucracy. This is the result primarily of the tardiness in the execution of the oil extraction plans in Russia. Thus, for instance, the second five-year plan set the increase in production from 23.3 million tons in 1932 to 1947 million tons in 1937. In fact, it increased only 30.5 million tons. In 1930, production did not reach more than 35 million tons, although the plan laid down a level of more than 50 million tons. With these miscalculations, the fourth five-year plan set a more moderate aim for 1950, 35.4 million tons. On examining the general plan for increase of production, it is clear that oil will be one of the most important bottlenecks in Russia. The Stalinist bureaucracy tried to overcome this bottleneck by taking over Romania and northern Iran. It did not succeed in the latter. Another factor motivating the expansion of Russia is the need for new labor power. In highly developed countries, the export of capital is a reaction to the rise of wages, which cuts into the rate of profit. It is directed to areas where labor power is cheap and thus increases the amount of labor exploited by the same quantity of capital. The same result was achieved in a different way when Nazi Germany brought millions of workers from the conquered countries, particularly of the East, into Germany. A cheaper labor power than that of the Russian worker, especially of the slave labor, is not to be found in Europe, so that the annexation of new areas to Russia cannot be motivated by the need to find cheaper labor power. But this does not mean that it is not motivated by the necessity to find an additional quantity of labor power. Even though the quantity of capital relative to the population in Russia is very small, it still suffers from a lack of labor power. This is to be explained by its wasteful use caused by the lack of capital, so that side by side with the lack of capital appears the lack of labor power. Hence slave labor and the low productivity of labor in agriculture. Every factor that impedes the productivity of labor, the bureaucracy itself included, will increase the wastage of labor power. This explains why, in spite of the gigantic population of Russia, the government finds it necessary to take special measures to increase it, such as the prohibition of abortion, fines for bachelors, and prizes for families with many children. The process goes round in a vicious circle. Lack of capital causes a wastage of labor power which makes it difficult to accumulate sufficient quantities of capital. And I think here Cliff is not referring to capital in the Marxist sense, but capital really in like the fundamentally bourgeois sense of means of production. That's just a side note for me. The addition to Russia of 100 million people from the countries of Eastern Europe is therefore an important motive for the expansion of Russian imperialism, paralleling the export of capital from the countries of advanced capitalism. One further motive for the expansion of Stalinist Russia is strategic considerations. The factors mentioned till now are not specific to Stalinist Russia alone. One factor, however, about which we have very incomplete information is specific. That is a slowing down of the rise of productivity of labor. According to our previous calculation, the productivity of labor, which official Russian statistics claim rose by 172%, in reality rose probably by 96.6% between 1928 and 1937. Whichever figure we accept, the rise is very rapid. And yet in 1937, the productivity of labor in Russian industry was still only 30 to 40% of that in American industry, even though the mechanization of Russian factories is the last word in technique. And the portion of their equipment installed very recently much larger than in the U.S. It is not excluded theoretically that the productivity of labor rises much more quickly than the new machinery is installed, when the new machinery is installed than years later. For, seeing that the bureaucracy is not under workers' control, as it is in a worker state on the one hand, and on the other that the income of every bureaucrat is not directly connected with the quality of that bureaucrat's management, a miscalculation at one stage of production may be introduced into the basis of planning and calculation at other stages, and so an accumulative process. Bureaucratic state capitalism thus may not be able to achieve the same productivity of labor using the same machinery as monopoly capitalism, not to speak of a worker state. From 1941, the Russian authorities stopped systematically publishing figures showing the absolute quantity of different products produced. The Russian authorities publish practically only relative figures. When the Russian authorities say, for instance, that the output of coal in, for example, 1940 was such and such a percentage higher than in 1945, we are still in the dark, as we do not know the output for 1945. According to official Russian statistics, the productivity of labor rose very much during the war years. It was an industry as a whole, 17% higher in 1941 than in 1940. In 1942, it rose in the armament industry by 15% above 1941, in aircraft by 30%, in tanks by 38%, in light industry by 46%. In 1943, the productivity of labor in the armament industry was nearly 20% higher than in 1942, in aircraft 15.1% higher, in the electrical industry 19.1% higher, in the chemical industry 12.7% higher, in light industry 15.1% higher. Thus, the productivity of labor in the armament industry in 1943 was about 70% higher than in 1940. Footnote. See P. Karamov, propagandist. Shit. Where the hell am I? The link didn't take me back to the right place. Okay, so where did I stop? Thus, the productivity of labor in the armament industry was in 1943 about 70% higher than in 1940. The rise in the productivity of labor as well as the saving in raw materials, according to official statistics, brought about a decline in the costs of production of war materials of 30 to 40%. Of course, such figures cannot be checked, and always in the past it has been found that the rise in percentage of uncheckable figures has been incomparably higher than in those that can be checked. It has been found, for example, that the rise in the production of coal, iron, steel, electricity, cement, textiles, etc., products whose quantity is measured in volume, has been much less than the rise in production of these products whose quantity is given only in prices, such as machinery, chemicals, etc. In addition, it is difficult to know to what extent the Russian statisticians took into account the lengthening of the labor day during the wax from 8 to 11 or 12 hours. The last absolute figures as regards output were given systematically for the years 1937 to 1940. These figures show a general extreme slowing down of the rise in production. All right, so this is a rather large chart I think I can explain. We can kind of like get the general patterns. Basically, what it's trying to say, I think what's trying to be demonstrated by this chart, or what this chart does demonstrate, is that overall production grew tremendously uh, up to like 1935, 36, and then started to drop between 1936 and 1940. So, for instance, um, steel went from zero point 0.6 production, I don't know what these units are, zero point 0.6 in 1928 to 29. In 1935, it went to, in 1935 to 36, the steel production went from 0. 0.6 to 3.8. And then by 1939 to 40, it's down to 0.2. So these aren't like overall. So this is the rate of increase, not like the overall quantity. So another example, and I'm not going to do these for all of these, would be pig iron. It says here between 1928 to 1929 was at 0.7, whatever unit this may be. I guess that's the increase in production rate. I guess it's the rate of production increases. Went from a 0.7 rate of production increases to a height of 3.3 production increases in 1933 to 34, and then by 1938 to 39, or 1939 to 1940, the rate of growth had dropped to 0.15. And I'll do one more example just for the shits of it. Electricity, the rate of growth of electricity was 1.5% in, I actually think that's what these units are. They're not quantities of things, but they're like percentage of increases. 0.5, electricity grew 0.5%, 1.5% in 1928 to 1929. And then in 1934, actually the highest number is 1935 to 36, its growth rate was 6.7%. And then by 1939 to 1940, the rate of growth of electricity had dropped all the way down to 0.6% rate of growth. So its peak was 6.7, and then it dropped to 0.6% growth. So what that's trying to say is there is an extreme degree of growth in the first 5 years, the Soviet 5-year plans, the first period, and then a drop off up to 1940. And then the cliff says, the tempo of the rise of the annual output will become even clearer if we compare the rise in the output of one product with its output in the previous year. And this, so let's say, it says annual increases in percentages. So, so I'm not exactly sure what the hell this is trying to say. What's different from this chart? Before we're talking about increases in production. Now we're talking about increases in percentages. I guess that's just how much it grew as opposed to the rate at which it grew. I guess is what this one is saying. So, for instance, in steel, in 1928 to 1929, grew by 14%. I guess 14% larger than the previous year. In 1940 1933 to 34, the output increased 40.6% over the previous year. But by 1939 to 1940, the output of steel increased only 1.1% from the previous year. So again, we're seeing that general trend, right? From the late 1920s, 1929, and 1935, about there was the growth is good, and then growth declines sharply. So pig iron, for instance, in 1928 to 1929, grew in size 21.2% over the previous year. In 1933 to 34, this number was pig iron production grew 46.5% from the previous year. But by 1938 to 39, it increased only 1% from the previous year. And electricity, again, between 1928 to 29, increased electricity production, increased the output of electricity, increased by 24%. And in 1935, this actually seem relatively a good example because there's not like a massive growth between the 1928 to 29 year and the 1934 to 35 year. It goes from 24% increase in 1928 to 29 to a 28% increase in 1934 to 35. But what it does follow the trend in the sense that between 1939 and 1941, the percentage of output of electricity grew only 1.5%. So that's a fall from 28.3% to 1.5%. Okay, I apologize for having the tedium of hearing me try to explain these charts. I feel like there's information in them that's useful, but it's very hard to verbalize. It's kind of something you have to look at. And that kind of actually keeps me from reading a lot of things that I might have otherwise read, because it's like it doesn't, all the things I read, I try to make recordings of. And, in this particular instance, it's showing that, things that have charts and like a lot of symbols and stuff, I can't really verbalize and comprehend at the same time, or just verbalize, period, whether I comprehend them or not. But anyway, only a couple paragraphs left here. Except for coal, the years 1936 to 1940 show a sharp drop in the rate of increase of output. The table as a whole shows to what extent bureaucratic management leads to a jerky development of production. The drastic decline in the rate of increase in the last years before the war may have been the result of the mass, quote, purges carried out at that time, but it is possible, on the other hand, that the drop was a main cause of the panic of the government, which drove it to employ the weapon of, quote, purges in an attempt to break the bottlenecks in production. The data are too paltry to decide this question conclusively. In a few years' time, we shall know without doubt whether the bureaucracy has become a factor which, while it does not absolutely prevent a rise in the quantity produced and the productivity of labor, has become a factor slowing down the rate of this rise. If this is the case, if the extent that it is so, it constitutes an additional motive for Stalinist Russia's imperialist expansion, which is specific to state capitalism run by a bureaucracy. The looting of the occupied countries, the use of their labor reservoirs to increase the surplus value in capital dominated over by the Russian bureaucracy, the creation of an industrial proletariat among the oppressed nations, all this creates a volcano of social and national antagonisms. The congruency of the social and national antagonisms of the local proletariat with the Russian bureaucracy must develop in the long run into a tremendous movement of national and social liberation. Footnote: this chapter is of necessity incomplete, as an analysis of Stalinist imperialism is impossible without taking into account the nature of the Stalinist parties, the relation between the Stalinist parties and the masses, and the relation between them and the bourgeoisie in the newly occupied countries of Eastern Europe. We shall deal with this in the following document, which discusses the Stalinist parties and the perspectives and tasks of the Fourth International. That's the end of the chapter. Thanks for listening. End footnote. That's the end of the chapter. All right. The next chapter, if you're curious, is titled The Class Struggle in Russia.